Welcome back to the second part of this tutorial series where we're going into the how to do configuration in ASP.NET Core, but we're also going to use console to get our configuration live out of the key value store. So first of all, we're going to make ourselves a little app so that for our test projects we can inject key values that we want. Now we could use the console exe, means that we'd have to drag an exe along with our repo. Or there are a number of other tools, but we're actually just going to make ourselves a little Docker-based console app in .NET. Shows you how to quickly make a Docker app here. Basically, you create a console app, you right-click on it, you say Add Docker. It makes you a set of YAML files down here in a Docker Compose file and a Docker file inside your project. Then we are going to add the configuration from condenser.net to it so that we can actually contact console. And in there is a set key method. So what we're going to do is just make a JSON file that has the keys that we'd like to add to our test environment. And later on, outside of this, because you don't need to watch it, I'll go through and script that up as well so that we'll have two things that will happen. Our SQL server will start up, our console agent will start up in dev mode, and then this Docker container will run and it will import any keys that we need to bootstrap our test environment. So for now, we're just going to go ahead and add a key called Swagger Processor Config, and then we will put the actual key name in here, so allow new methods. So you can imagine that we've got our actual Swagger processor working at this point, and we have some rules around whether or not new methods are allowed to be added before our API is invalidated. We'll also have another key, and this is a bit of a fake key, probably not going to end up in our configuration, but this will be called delay processing. And this will just halt our processing for a certain amount of time because we haven't got any real work to do right now, and we're just going to mimic some work by using a delay. So for now, we'll give it a 4,000 millisecond delay, and we'll save that file. And then we're going to add ourselves another class, which will just be a key and value, so that we can deserialize our JSON file into that, just to make things easy for us. And we'll give it the same properties, key and value. Pretty simple stuff. So what we're going to do is deserialize that JSON file, and then iterate over each one and insert them into console. Now, one thing we'll probably do to expand this is to say any JSON file in a certain folder, and that could either be injected by an environment variable. Actually, I'll most likely inject that via an environment variable. So that means that what we can do is from externally to our container, we can start up our container, inject an environment variable of where we've copied files or mapped files into that Docker container, and it will run all of them and inject all the keys. That way, it means that like if you've got a bunch of different services that are going to start up, or have been modified over time or whatever, then you can actually just have a list of different files that all get imported one after the other. Obviously, you could just put them all in one file as well, but it makes it just a bit, a bit more separation if you say there's one file per service or service type, or maybe one type of configuration. So say if you've got a database timeout or something like that, and you could call it the database settings, for instance. As we saw earlier, you don't need to put the addresses or ports or anything like that in, however. So we're going to make ourselves just a console registry. We don't want to change any of the settings, so we can pass a null for the settings there. And then we'll call setKey async. So we'll need to do a for each around that. So do a for each over our keys, giving us back KV. Now, one interesting thing about console is that if you're going to import them directly, say from an export and import, it actually stores the key value as base 64. That's because you can store anything you want in the key. It doesn't actually have to be text values. We are going to store text values. We're going to get them forward and back as text values. And the library will take care of converting that automatically for us. Actually, the console API does that, sorry. we push a text value up there, it stores it as a base64 value. So we'll make a list of tasks because it's async in nature, and we'll push up the key, we'll push up the value, add the task to the list, and then we'll wait all on the end. Obviously, normally you'd say when all, but however, this is not C# 7.2, so we don't have an async main method. So that's that done. Now, what we'll do is you actually need to run, sorry, I did the wrong thing there. What we'll actually do here, there we go, we'll debug Docker. So we just debugged Docker, and it says here that it couldn't launch the debugger. Now the reason for this is, if you want to debug Docker containers, you actually need to make sure C drive is shared, because Visual Studio uses a folder under the user folder to bootstrap basically the debugger. So now that that's done, and boom, we're stepping in. Now the interesting thing about this is we are stepping in, but this is running inside a Linux container running inside Docker. Now if we reload, we can see we've created our keys. There they are there. Perfect, now we have ourselves a little console app that can add keys. So let's move on to actually using them in our ASP.NET app. So if we jump over to our app here, first thing we'll do is we will make a model for our config. We'll call that the same thing, Swagger processing config. No, processor, sorry, Swagger processor config. Now, it doesn't actually have to have the same name as that key there. I'll show you that shortly. And we'll chuck the two methods on there. So one for a bool. And as you can see, even though it's actually stored as base64, the library deserializes it into strings as it comes through, and then the JSON parser will turn it into the right types for us. It's pretty neat, really. All around, I think. So it's a combination of the library for console working together with the ASP.NET deserialization of JSON for settings. So here we go. We come over to our startup. And what we're going to do is we are going to put a constructor. We'll get rid of that port now because we're not using that anymore. Put a constructor on our startup. The only thing that can be injected into the startup, there we go, is actually the iHosting environment. I'm not sure we actually need to use that here, but we'll inject that anyway. And then we're going to create ourselves a config registry. So it'll just be a new condenser.net.configuration.registry. There we go, and we'll pass on null because we don't need to change any of the settings. Once again, we're just contacting localhost 8500, and we'll simplify that. And then next up, we are going to say config registry, and then we're going to add a static key path. So what we're saying is that we want everything from inside the tree, and what it'll actually do is it'll recursively load all the keys from anything underneath the static key path that you put in, and it will put them inside the configuration root just like it would if you loaded it from a JSON file off the disk, and that is that the path will be separated with colons inside the dictionary of settings. So it provides us with a config root, so that all works nicely. And then if we come down here, what we'll do is we'll go services, and we need to add options to that because now we're using the iOptions interface. So we add the options services, and then we say services.configure, and we're going to configure our Swagger processor config, and then we inject the configuration that we want. Now, actually what we want to do is do get section, because the section is the Swagger processor config. See there, and what that will say is any property underneath that Swagger processor config, try and map it to a property inside that class. Now over on our controller, the iOptions, and wrapping the Swagger processor config, and we'll save that internally. Now obviously one of these controllers is made every time it gets called. Every time a method's called on there, not singleton in nature. And then down, and then we'll start that up and see what happens. So we'll start up our host. And then what we'll do is we'll call that from our sample. And we can see we've come into here. And if we look inside our config, look inside the value property, and we can see allow new methods true, and the delay is 400 milliseconds. What we're going to do now is change it a little bit to what you'd more likely see in a console tree. So you probably wouldn't pick config because you know it's config, it's in the tree. And you might have something like my company / condenser because this is the project, or you might have my company / web servers, or front-end servers, or however you want to group the configuration. And then what we'll do is we'll come over here. Oh, there we go. And now we can see after we've run it that we've got another set. Now the old ones haven't gone. They will go when we flush it and restart, but for now they're there. So we come back to our startup, and we actually change the static key path that we pull in. So we're going to pull in anything under my company / condenser, and then we can change the name of that. And now you can see it doesn't have to match the class names. The only thing that have to match are the properties. And obviously the types need to be deserialized into those. So let's run that again. And we can see we've come over to our Swagger config, and we're still getting the values. So that's perfect. So in our next step, what we'll see here is that this is our config value. We'll see this every time we run. What we're going to do is start running that sample from disk, not disks, from outside the IDE, just because it makes it easier to see. And what we'll do is we'll pass through our result, and we're going to await for a delay based on what's in the config value. So there's a delay for processing. So then we can see if the configuration is working a little bit easier. So we'll jump over to our samples folder and we'll .NET run on that. That way it will let us just loop through and loop through rather than having to restart that application for every debug. It'll fail the first time because we're not running a web server, so we should get an exception back. So .NET run, and we get an exception back because it can't connect. That's fine. So we start up our web server. It's now running. Now we try hitting it again. Let me check. And the response was 2. That's fine, it's added another. Now what we might do is just change this so we can see the config value. So we can see if it's changing. And we start that up. Once again. Now, dynamic configuration may make some sense when you've got JSON files on disk, but normally that's going to require some kind of push out to the servers or redeploy of your services or code anyway. However, when you've got a distributed key value store, which is super quick, you may want to be able to push configuration out in real time. So if we go ahead and change this to 8000, what we're going to see is, if we hit that, it's still 4000. That means that we'd require recycling our process to get that to update. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to add an updating path async. Now there's a little bit more overhead. It's not much because it's a blocking query or a long polling effectively, but it is a tiny bit more overhead. So if you don't need it, you don't need to add it. Also, if your app's not expecting settings to change on the fly and that could cause problems, then also don't add it. But what you can see here now is it's still 8000. So even though the keys changed, it's 8000. So what we're going to do is we're going to add configure reloadable. This time we need to actually pass in the iRegistry because it's a service that's provided on the condenser library. So we'll change this to an iConfiguration registry, and we'll change this here. And finally we will pass in configuration, and then we can pass in the section like this. There we go. Now we start this back up, and let's take a look again and see what happens now when we change the configuration. So it was 4,000, fine, that's what we changed it to. And if we go ahead and change this to 5,000, update it, now the web server hasn't restarted, and the result is going to be hopefully 5,000. There we go. So what we've seen here is we can configure stuff on the fly. In the next video, we're going to take a look at logging, and we're going to take a different way of getting live real-time configuration. Thanks for watching. I hope it's been useful, and we'll see you back here for logging.